The more performance and power-based we are, probably the lower carb state that we want to be in. The more volume-based we are, less neurological demand, probably the higher carb state that we want to be in. And maybe in those high volume sessions, this might also be where like the creatine and amino acids go up higher because we're going to be burning through more of that stuff then during our session. Welcome back, guys. So today's video is going to be about peri-workout nutrition, meaning nutrition that surrounds your workout. Okay, so we're looking at before, during, and after. And the reason for making this is, hey, it's quite important. You know, it's the most strenuous part of your day or whatever, physically speaking. But also there tends to be quite a lot of confusion about it, a lot of contradicting information. So a lot of people just end up not really worrying about it at all because they don't really know where to start. And my goal here is just to give you a bit of a framework to work with so you can start doing something that hopefully is better than what you're doing now. And, you know, because at the end of the day, a bad plan is better than no plan, and then you can kind of refine it. But what we're going to try and do is just kind of bed down like what's needed and when, and how might that differ depending on the type of training session that you're doing, because that really does change things and that doesn't get talked about a lot. But let's just look at the windows first. So the first off, we're looking at pre-workout. So we want to prepare the body for the workout to come. We want to be primed and ready to work hard, right? So let's first look at, probably would be a good time taking some electrolytes, right? Because we want to, if you're correcting your hydration once you started training, it's probably already too late. You know, like once you feel thirsty, it's kind of too late type thing, right? So probably a good idea to put some electrolytes in the system before so that we can fully absorb them and be well hydrated when we go into the gym, because nothing is going to rob you of performance quicker than dehydration. You know, that could be like Element, for example, is fantastic for that, obviously. So we're putting some electrolytes in the system. Now, probably also a good idea to bring in some carbohydrates at this point, because we're about to burn through a lot of blood sugar. Obviously, depends what you're doing, but there's going to be quite a decent amount used there. And what we're trying to do here is make sure that our muscle glycogen stores get depleted as either as little as possible or as late in the workout as possible. Because once they start getting depleted, the muscle then obviously comes depleted, also kind of deflates, for want of a better word. We start to lose leverage and power output and stability, okay? So the fuller we can keep those muscular glycogen stores, the better. So that's gonna mean two things. First off, obviously, we want some blood sugar in the system so that we don't have to start liberating that muscular glycogen straight away. But the other thing is we need to monitor our liver glycogen stores, okay? So the liver also stores a huge amount of glycogen. And funny enough, your body thinks that your liver is slightly more important than your biceps or whatever it is you're training, right? So if your liver glycogen stores are not full, glycogen will be liberated from elsewhere to be stored preferentially in the liver, because the liver is kind of important for things, right? So this is why, personally, this is where I would like to see fruit brought in for the fructose. Obviously, you could use your own kind of fructose powder or whatever it is you want, but fructose generally gets a bad rap because it's like, yeah, but it goes to the liver first. But actually, that's a good thing, because if the liver is being replenished and is full, then we're not depleting elsewhere to do that. And whatever fructose is left is now going to go and spill over to anywhere else, okay? So like bringing some carbs in the form of fruit at this point would be a very good idea. Now, the trade-off, right? And we've literally just recorded the sleep seminar just now. This is why we're still rolling, because we're already here. It'd be rude not to, right? The problem is that to perform well, we need cortisol. We should have a drinking game where that you guys drink every time I say the word cortisol. That'd be hilarious. If we want to perform well, we need cortisol and adrenaline to be reasonably high. Okay? What makes us feel ready to get up and go, increases processing speed, all that cool stuff, right? Like increases power output, force production, all that. We need this reasonably high. Now, when blood sugar goes up, that way is up. Well, then these end up coming down because their primary role is maintaining stable blood sugar levels. So if we spike blood sugar too high, right, these come down too much, and then we just feel lethargic. Like, think about the last time you went out for like dinner and ate too much, right? Especially if it was carb heavy. Like, how do you feel after that? well, this is super high, this is super light, you're going to go fall asleep on the sofa. It's not a good position to be in for a workout. So this needs to be moderated to the point where you have enough in the system that you can work with. The liver stores aren't depleted. You've got some blood sugar to work with, but we're not half asleep, okay? And then the other thing that we should probably bring in at this point, like this, let's think of this as like our physical fuel source, right? We probably also should bring in some kind of cognitive fuel source, right? Especially if we're dealing with a session that's very like performance based would be more important. So let's look at something like, we could bring in something like choline, okay? In whatever forms. This could be alpha GPC, could be citicoline, there's a whole bunch, right? It could be injectable choline. Injectable choline is awesome for the record. I think CDP choline as well. Okay, let's just go with choline. So like let's say we're doing like a strength or a power-based workout, or maybe a workout where we're learning a new lift. Something that's gonna take up a lot of cognitive resources, right? Well, choline comes in and helps us increase levels of acetylcholine, which not only is basically a direct neurological fuel source, also plays a very key role in motor learning. So choline would be a great thing to spike at this time, right? But let's say we don't want to do that. We could also bring in something like ketones. And ketones are basically direct fuel source for your brain. We could bring in one of those to make sure that we have enough neurological fuel to handle the session that is ahead of us. So we've settled and sorted out our hydration. We've put enough carbs in the system, ideally through fruit or fructose, to make sure the liver glycogen stores are full and that blood sugar levels are stable. And we've given our brain something to work with there as well, so we don't end up hitting the wall in that sense. So now what about during? Well, we've already talked about maintaining a stable blood sugar level, so some form of carbs is probably wise here, right? But once again, there's a couple of things that we need to be wary of, right? We need to be aware of this. Spike blood sugar too high, cortisol and adrenaline will come down. There's the other problem that we have to deal with, which is called reactive hypoglycemia. And this is reasonably common, okay? So what happens, right? So when you're doing your workout, you're burning through blood sugar at a reasonable rate, or at least we'd hope so. You know, you're not slacking, just texting for half an hour in between, right? So blood sugar levels are dropping because you're physically active. But then what you do is you go and put this massive bolus of carbs in your system during the workout. So a big bolus of carbs go in, insulin comes up. Now, what does insulin do? Well, insulin brings down blood sugar levels. So not only are you bringing down blood sugar levels because you're training, you've now spiked insulin super high because of this bolus of carbs. So you have two things pulling down blood sugar levels at the same time, right? And now you end up hypoglycemic in the middle of your workout, which obviously isn't great for performance, but then you're kind of left there like, dude, I just necked 75 grams of carbs. How on earth am I hypoglycemic? This. So we obviously want to avoid that too, which is why, again, we need to be careful about how much we titrate into the system. Now, in a perfect world, this would be done in the form of highly branched cyclic dextrin. And the reason for that is because for some weird reason, which we haven't quite figured out yet, highly branched cyclic dextrin doesn't really spike insulin. Gram for gram really doesn't spike insulin anywhere near as much as all your other traditional carb sources, right? So because it's got super small molecular weight as well, it's very readily absorbed. And then because it doesn't spike insulin, we don't have to worry about blood sugar being pulled down too much and getting that hypoglycemia. So we can consume more of it during our workout without any negative effect. If you want to stick to dextrose and maltodextrin and all those, that's fine, totally fine. Just be aware that the amount of highly branched cyclic dextrin you can take in before you hit issues is going to be higher than dextrose, for example. But depending on how much you need, which we'll address in a bit, that may or may not be a problem, okay? Again, it would probably be a good idea to put a small amount, at least, of electrolytes in there to replace what we are getting rid of. And then personally, what I like to put in here for most people is creatine and essential amino acids. So why do we put those in during a workout? Well, what happens when you're training, right? Now, yes, blood flow to the gut is not as prolific as other times, so like the absorption isn't as fast, but where is blood flow being prioritized to during the workout? To your muscles. Where do we want creatine and essential amino acids to go? To the muscles. So although we may not be able to absorb them quite as quickly at this time during our workout, we can probably overcome that detriment by biasing their flow to the muscle tissue, which is where we want them to go. So that's why these would go in. So like these EAAs, you are going to be burning through amino acids for energy to some degree, might be quite small depending on how high your carb intake is and your caloric intake in general, but this will help maintain your nitrogen balance during your workout, which is just going to take the edge off how much muscle breakdown we experience during that workout. And then these creatine is going to come in and maintain those creatine phosphate stores during our workout. Now, that's not to say you wouldn't also take creatine at other times, totally can, but just be aware there probably is a benefit to taking it specifically during the workout. Okay, and then we look at post-workout. Now, probably not a popular opinion, but in reality, if we've done this stuff, post-workout tends to be the least important because there's nothing that we immediately need to be ready for to do. There's nothing that we need to be prepared for. We have probably at least 24 hours, in most cases, maybe more, to recover before our next workout. So, if you're going to do any of them, do the first two. But what could we put here? Well, now let's look at assuming that the average person trains in like the afternoon or the evening after work. Let's just look at that, right? Well, you're going to be in a very revved up state, right? You're going to be very sympathetic because like you just had a good workout. You had to mobilize all that energy, right? So how do we come down from that? How do we like get ourselves to a place where like we can now go and have dinner and kind of go to sleep? Well, let's look at, we could bring in things that are basically sleep aids for most part. We could bring in magnesium, which is going to help uncouple adrenaline from the adrenaline receptor. So your level of adrenaline comes down, you feel more relaxed and more chilled. We could bring in glycine, which has a really cool way of bringing down core body temperature, which is a big part of you going into a parasympathetic and relaxed state. So this brings down adrenaline and cortisol. Now, depending on what your calorie, carb, macro allowances allow, this could also be another place where we bring in carbs. And again, they would ideally be high GI carbs, because that is going to further bring down adrenaline and cortisol. And whilst that's great, probably not quite as important as making sure we're fueled during the workout. Okay? Most important thing is having the best workout possible, right? Like I said, we've got a bit of time to recover here. So for me, those would be the most important things to put in, right? Like I said, for me, these two are the most important, this maybe less so. But how does this differ then based on the type of training you're doing? Well, let's say you are in a hypertrophy macro cycle, right? And we're doing like a traditional, maybe a volume-based, like body part split type of training. Maybe the volume is very high. So let's just, going to be getting a little bit low here, but let's just say volume session, right? Which in this circumstance is going to mean like more resistance machines, cables, less neurologically demanding work. So if we're doing a lot of volume of work, we're going to be burning through more substrate, especially more glucose, right? But also the type of work that we're doing doesn't have this huge neurological component to it. We don't need to be super ramped up to do like sets of 8 to 12 on a machine chest press, for example, right? So in this circumstance, keeping adrenaline and cortisol high is less important. It's going to be less detrimental to our performance. And we're also going to be burning through more substrate. So if we're doing like a volume-based session, we might actually have more carbs pre and intra, because it doesn't matter if that cortisol drops. We're still going to have more than enough kind of neurological activation to deal with the work that we're doing. But now we're really, really worried about having enough fuel to make sure we do that and keep those intramuscular glycogen stores nice and full. Okay, so then we might have a lot of these pre and intra and maybe little to none after. Because if you've put, I don't know, for argument's sake, like 50 in here and 100 in here, you're not in desperate need of carbs immediately after your workout. Like, you flooded the system with them. Maybe you have some, but it's not like an integral need at that point, right? But then let's look at the other side of that. Let's say you wake up first thing in the morning and you want to do a plyometric session. So let's go power, right? Or any other style of training where neurological function needs to be at its absolute highest. So we want cortisol and adrenaline to be high at this point because we want maximal power production, maximal force output. We're also probably not doing a huge amount of volume if we're doing like a power workout or say a max strength workout. So in that scenario, we're probably not going to bring in really any or much carbs pre and intra, because if we don't really need them. And B, if we do, we end up bringing this down, which is integral to our workout performance, right? But then what we might do to compensate for that, because this session then is going to be low on carbs, high on neurological function, it's going to spike cortisol and adrenaline super high. Well, then we might want to bring in a really big bolus of carbs after the workout to allow that cortisol and adrenaline level to come back down, so that we're not just wired all day, okay? And then, then we can probably say pretty safely, like if we have, let's say we got a typical like power building session, right? We're doing a bit of strength work, a bit of hypertrophy work, kind of a blend of everything. Well, then we're gonna kind of be moderate throughout. In terms of our carb intake. Okay? Even keel, because maybe we even don't have this, because in most scenarios, right, if we're doing that type of workout, the strength work probably comes first in the vast majority of cases. Maybe the pre-workout carbs are pretty low to allow the cortisol and adrenaline to be pretty high during the more neurologically demanding stuff. And then we put more of our carbs intra and post then, so that we start bleeding the carbs into the system once the neurologically demanding work is done. We can also kind of then scale this back a little bit based on these different types of workouts. And it's like, well, let's say we're doing this like plyometric or very neurologically demanding session. This might be a place where we bias more things like choline and ketones before the session. These might go higher because we want our nervous system function to be at the absolute best. Maybe that's a case where, something like caffeine would be more warranted, traditional type of stimulant, right? That would be somewhere where that would be very helpful. But let's say like we're doing a more volume-based session that's purely targeted hypertrophy. Well, if we're really worried about hypertrophy, maybe we would bring in something like leucine pre-workout, because leucine will spike IGF-1 and mTOR pathways, which is great, because what that means is if we take it pre-work, it generally gets looked at as a post-workout supplement, but it actually works better pre, because basically then you get a bigger mTOR spike from the session that's about to happen. So if we're worried about hypertrophy, maybe we put in a bolus of leucine then before the workout. So what I'm trying to get across here is that depending on the type of session that you've got coming your way, you can tinker with this to make it more or less effective. But for me, the most pertinent bit, if you're only going to tinker with one dial, it's going to be that carb intake, because that then kind of indirectly is going to determine the state of your neurological state of arousal, for want of a better way to put it. So like the more performance and power based we are, probably the lower carb state that we want to be in. The more volume based we are, less neurological demand, probably the higher carb state that we want to be in. And maybe in those high volume sessions, this might also be where like the creatine and amino acids go up higher, because we're going to be burning through more of that stuff then during our session. So hopefully that inane rambling gave you a little bit of a blueprint of like what you could possibly do with your peri-workout nutrition, gives you a little bit of a structure to work with. But what I would say is that the most integral ones are going to be the carbs and the electrolytes for the vast majority of people, but how much of those you need is going to be dependent on the type of session. Hopefully that was useful. As always, thank you very much for supporting Elite FTS. We will see you next time.